So, welcome to our webinar presentation today, continuing with the theme of a just transition to clean sources of energy that leaves no one behind. And today our focus is on the health consequences of the climate emergency driven by fossil fuels and other environmental challenges. Health considerations bring the need for a just transition to cleaner energy closer to home. One doesn't need to believe in climate change per se to choose to work towards a fossil fuel free future. Everyone who has or loves someone who has suffered from deteriorating health from fossil fuel pollution should find common cause in today's topic. Anyone who believes that the mission of the church is intimately tied to Jesus' call to leave no one behind, especially not the poor, the marginalized, the oppressed, should find common cause in today's topic. A just transition leaves no one behind. Health. Slide. Shortly, you'll meet our guest speaker, Natalia Reyes-Becerra, but I wanted to remind you all of the focus of our webinars leading up to the Community of Christ World Conference starting in late May. We've been laying the groundwork for the conference to consider the resolution calling for a just transition away from fossil fuels. We emphasize the word just because impacts of fossil fuel use are felt differently by different communities. This is particularly true for the health of communities of color, the elderly, and children. Next. The awareness of these disparities in the minds of everyday Americans is growing. In December last year, the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication conducted a survey of Americans and have produced a report of results from that survey. The title of the report is Climate Change in the American Mind: Public Perceptions of the Health Harms of Global Warming, Fall 2024. Next. Here are the key findings. 39% of Americans think Americans' health is currently being harmed by global warming, and that's an 8 percentage point increase from a decade ago in their last survey. And compared with 2014, many more Americans think that the health problems such as heat stroke, air pollution, asthma, and other lung diseases, and pollen-related allergies will become more common in their communities if global warming is not addressed. And again, compared with 2014, many more Americans trust a broad range of information sources about the health harms of global warming, including half or more of Americans who trust primary care physicians, first responders, and climate scientists. Okay, next. The Yale survey asked who Americans believe will most likely experience health problems from global warming. 47% of Americans understand that some groups in the US are more likely than others to experience health problems related to global warming. And that's a 13% increase from a decade ago. And when asked to name groups more likely to be affected, Americans most commonly identify low-income persons, older adults, people with health conditions, and people of color. Americans are increasingly aware of the impacts on low-income people and people of color. So we're pleased that we have a guest speaker today to help us understand the reasons why these views on climate change and health are so widely held and increasing. Andrew?
Thank you, Dean. Before I introduce our speaker today, I thought I'd share a little story about how I became to ask American Lung Association to present for us. Since a child, I've been an asthma sufferer, and I had it really bad in my younger years through my teenage years. It was probably at its worst when we moved to live in Chapeltown, near Sheffield, in the north of England, within sight of the flame coming from the steelworks. And little did I know that the two things were related. This was also a time when methane, or natural gas to us in the UK, was being introduced for heating and cooking. And so it became the way to heat our homes and to cook our food. And we had both in our house. I was encouraged to play the trumpet to control my breathing. And then I got into running, which seemed to help, although my recovery time was much longer than most. As an adult, the symptoms were less of a problem, and I became accustomed to the occasional asthma attack, the constant wheezing, and the shortness of breath, now triggered also by hay fever. I returned to running for exercise in my 50s and decided to lose some weight. And the combination of these resulted in my doctor declaring me cured of asthma. I stopped using my preventative inhaler and only used my emergency inhaler once a year when needed, normally during the pollen season. Post-pandemic, I started to feel breathless again, even waking during the night gasping, and so I went back to my doctor, who diagnosed me with asthma. And I was so shocked by this that I asked, how can this be? And he said, most probably pollution is the cause. And I was referred to a few organisations that could help me understand and also help me to campaign for cleaner air. One of those organisations was Asthma and Lung UK. It was corresponding with asthma and lung that got me thinking about the effects on us all and to all creation that the increasing pollution from industry and especially the burning of fossil fuels was having. I sent them a question asking if they might be interested in presenting for one of our webinars. And in reply, they referred me to the American Lung Association, which in turn led me to Natalia. So, Natalia Reyes-Becerra is a nationwide clean air advocacy manager with the American Lung Association, working to advance protections from air pollution and climate change. Prior to joining the Lung Association, Natalia worked on a federal health policy initiatives with the National Alliance for Hispanic Health, and previously was a Capitol Executive Fellow working with senior level leaders in the Department of Toxic Substances Control within California's Environmental Protection Agency on issues at the intersection of health and environmental justice. Natalia holds a BA in ethnicity, race, and migration from Yale University, and the graduate certificate in applied policy and government from California State in Sacramento. Now, we'll all have a chance to ask questions of Natalia, and I can ask you to put your questions into the chat during the presentation. That will be brilliant. So, Natalia, from all of us, friends and members of Community of Christ, and from the North American Climate Justice Team, we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say to us. So, it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you all for having me. I will go ahead and share my slides. Let me just make sure I am in presenter mode.
Looks good. Oh, now you're back out.
Oh,
Now
how's that?
Now you're in. Yeah.
Okay, amazing. Okay, well, thank you again for having me. I'll be talking today about the health impacts of climate change and air pollution. And as Andrew mentioned, I'm a nationwide advocacy manager with the American Lung Association. So our vision is a world free of lung disease, and that includes championing clean air for all. So what we know is that people around the world are facing record-breaking threats to their health and well-being from the rapidly changing climate. That's from exposure to extreme heat, hotter, drier weather conditions that are fueling wildfires and dust storms, and climate and changing weather patterns that are rising temperatures and increasing the risk of deadly infectious diseases. The science is clear that climate change is a health emergency, and communities across the country and across the world are already experiencing its impacts. Nearly the entire US experienced much above average temperatures during 2024, with concentrated areas of record warmth across the Southwest, deep Southwest, upper Midwest, and Great Lakes, and from the Central Appalachians to the Northeast. Apologies if you can hear my dog barking in the background. 17 states had their warmest year on record, while all but 2 remaining states across the lower 48 ranked as one of the warmest 5 years on record. Now, globally, in 2023, infants and adults older than 65 years experienced a new record high of 13.8 days of heat wave per person on average. Heat-related deaths of people over 65 years of age reached a record high level, and that was 167% higher than from 1990 to 1999. And that's what you can see here in this graph. This is more than twice the increase that would have been expected without temperature changes from climate change. Extreme heat can be deadly. It causes more deaths per year than any other weather-related hazard, and climate change is making it worse. Heat is also linked to a wide array of short-term and long-term illnesses, including exacerbation of cerebrovascular illness like stroke, respiratory diseases like asthma, worsening ozone concentrations, which worsens respiratory disease, increases in cardiovascular disease, such as heart attacks, increases in renal disease, such as kidney failure, and increases in preterm births and adverse birth outcomes. Climate change is also making wildfires more frequent and intense. Wildfire smoke contains a complex mixture of particles and gases that are harmful to health. The primary pollutant of concern is fine particles, or PM 2.5, which are so small that they can penetrate deep into the lungs and even enter the bloodstream. When wildfires burn in urban areas, like we saw with the recent wildfires in Los Angeles, other harmful components are added to the smoke, such as lead, plastics, and hazardous household chemicals that can cause long-term health effects, including cancer. Exposure to smoke can exacerbate asthma and other lung diseases, including COPD, reduce lung function, increase the risk of heart attack and stroke, increase the risk of emergency room visits and hospital admissions, and increase risk of cancers, dementia, and adverse pregnancy and birth outcomes. Climate change also contributes to more frequent and severe storms and floods, causing injuries, worsening physical and mental health, and cutting people off from their healthcare. Health harms are also present post-flood too, and what we can see here on the right is the aftermath of Hurricane Laura, which caused a chemical plant fire outside of Lake Charles in Louisiana. Disease-carrying insects like ticks and mosquitoes are also multiplying and spreading to new areas, increasing exposure to illnesses like Lyme disease and dengue fever. Waterborne and foodborne pathogens are also spreading. In the figure on the right, we see that cases of vector-borne diseases from infected mosquitoes, ticks, and fleas in the United States and territories tripled from 2004 to 2016. We also know that the allergy seasons are getting longer and more intense. So the burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, gas are by far the largest contributor to global climate change, accounting for 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions and nearly 90% of all carbon dioxide emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions blanket the Earth and trap the sun's heat, leading to global climate change. The largest source of greenhouse gas emissions from human activity in the US is from the burning of fossil fuels for electricity, heat, and transportation. The manufacturing industry is one of the largest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. Manufacturing and industry produce emissions mostly from burning fossil fuels to produce energy for making things like cement, iron, steel, electronics, and other goods. Mining and construction also release gases. Transportation is another major contributor of greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide emissions. Most cars, trucks, ships, and planes run on fossil fuels. Transportation accounts for nearly 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions in the US, when accounting for end-use indirect emissions, and 1/4 of global energy-related carbon dioxide emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions from the commercial and residential sector come from fossil fuels burned for heat and uses of gas for refrigeration and cooling in buildings. Globally, residential and commercial buildings consume over half of all electricity. And what we also know is that fossil fuels can directly harm health as well as contributing to climate change. The burning of fossil fuels can emit harmful air pollutants such as particle pollution, mercury, nitrogen oxides, and volatile organic compounds. For instance, air pollutants from coal-fired power plants and diesel-fueled vehicles can lead to respiratory and cardiovascular diseases, lung cancer, diabetes, neurological disorders, and adverse pregnancy outcomes. Coal and oil-fired power plants emit mercury, which is a neurotoxin that can cause severe developmental harm, even in small amounts. This includes developmental birth defects, serious effects on the nervous, digestive, and immune systems, and on the lungs, kidneys, skin, and eyes. Oil and gas production emit volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, alongside methane. VOCs include hazardous air pollutants such as benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, mixed xylenes, N-hexane, and formaldehyde, which can cause a range of adverse outcomes, including certain cancers and respiratory impacts. VOCs also lead to the formation of ground-level ozone. Ground-level ozone, sometimes known as smog, is one of the most widespread and dangerous pollutants in the US. Ozone forms in the lower atmosphere when a combination of pollutants, usually nitrogen oxides and volatile organic compounds, cook together in sunlight through a series of chemical reactions. If these ingredients are present under the right conditions, they can react to form ozone. Sunlight is key, with higher temperatures increasing ozone production. Ozone gas is a powerful lung irritant, and when it's inhaled into the lungs, it reacts with delicate lining of the small airways, causing inflammation and other damage that can impact multiple body systems. Ozone exposure can also shorten lives. It has a serious effect on the respiratory system, both in the short term and over the course of years of exposure. When ozone levels are high, many people experience breathing problems, such as chest tightness, coughing, and shortness of breath, often within hours of exposure. Even healthy young adults may experience respiratory symptoms and decreased lung function. And this slide illustrates the wide range of harm caused by air pollution. Now, everyone's health is at risk from climate change, regardless of where you live, but many people are at an increased risk of getting sick or injured. This includes children, seniors, pregnant people, people with chronic diseases like asthma and diabetes, people who work outdoors, people with disabilities, people with lower incomes who have fewer resources to protect themselves, and people of color. Basically, someone in everybody's family. Now, every year since 2000, the Lung Association has published our State of the Air report, which focuses public attention on ozone and particle pollution, which are two of the most widespread and dangerous air pollutants. The report gives grades to 885 out of the 911 counties with regulatory monitors and ranks 25 metro areas with the worst and cleanest pollution levels for 3 pollutants: ozone, short-term particle pollution, and annual particle pollution. Last year's report found that 131 million people living in counties received at least one F grade. That's up nearly 120 million from the 2023 report, amounting to 4 in every 10 people in the US, including nearly 2 million children with asthma, 15.7 million adults with chronic lung disease, and some of our other most vulnerable constituents. The disparity in exposure to air pollution is also along racial and ethnic lines and continues to be a serious concern. Although people of color are about 42% of the overall population of the US, they are 52% of people living in counties with at least one failing grade. And in the counties with the worst air quality that get failing grades for all 3 measures, people of color are more than twice as likely as white people to be affected. 63% of the population compared to 37% who are white. One of the key findings from last year's report was that particle pollution is continuing to get worse. In last year's report, 65 million people in counties that got an F grade for short-term particle pollution. There was 65 million people lived in counties that got an F grade for short-term particle pollution, and that was an increase from last year's report. And more cities on our 25 most polluted list got worse than got better. And 7 of those cities hit their highest number of days ever in our reporting. And wildfires are a major contributing factor to this trend. So wildfires are not only increasing the number of days and places with unhealthy spikes in particle pollution, but they're also increasing the severity of that pollution, resulting in the sharp increase seen over the last several reports of the number of days designated as either purple or maroon on the air quality index. These very unhealthy and hazardous days are a serious threat to everyone living in those areas and are unlike anything we've seen in the history of the state of the air. Last year's report showed that over 32 million people in 58 counties across 10 states experienced purple or maroon days for daily particle pollution. And this is an alarming trend, as you can see with this graph, that's likely to continue as climate change worsens. Now, if you're interested in finding more information for your state and your county, you can visit lung.org/SOTA, and that will give you the data from our 2024 report. And the data for our 2025 report will be released on April 23rd, so coming up next month. And now one of the other key findings from the report was that if you look over time at the trends, you can see that the Clean Air Act and other regulations that are seeking to clean our air are working. Controls on industry, power plants, the transportation sector have significantly reduced emissions of particle and ozone precursor pollutants. If you look at the trend lines for county and city pages of the on the State of the Air website, you'll see almost always a downward trend in the number of bad air days from the first report in 2000 up to 2017. And that in 2017 is when many of the levels in many places started to climb again, especially for particle pollution. Cleanup efforts have been continuing since that time, but what we're seeing is the effect of climate change, which is beginning to outpace the progress that we've already made. So what can we do? Well, one positive note here is that, as Dean pointed out in going over the survey at the beginning, that surveys repeatedly show that the majorities of Americans support climate and clean energy policies. So this survey, 2024 survey from the Yale Program on Climate Change and Communication, found support for a transition to clean energy. It found that majorities of Americans in all 50 states think that global warming is affecting the weather in the US. Majorities in 47 states support a US transition from fossil fuels to 100% clean energy by 2050. And support for transition to 100% clean energy was spatially varied, but still strong across many states. A poll from the Lung Association in 2024 also found strong support for limits on air pollution. So 74% of voters nationwide supported the EPA updating standards with stricter limits on air pollution, and 83% supported placing a priority on standards that clean up pollution in the most polluted American neighborhoods. The majority of respondents also supported setting stricter limits on mercury and other air toxics and emissions from power plants, and also supported stronger limits on smog from power plants, oil refineries, and other industrial facilities. A 2025 poll, so a recent poll from Hart Research, also found opposition to rolling back clean energy policies. So majorities opposed the Trump administration's proposed rollbacks to climate and clean energy policies. And there was the most intense pushback against proposals to eliminate protections for clean air and water from toxic pollution, and also attempts to cut government support for communities that have been impacted by extreme weather events. So we have to call on leaders at every level to take action to dramatically reduce pollution that drives climate change and harms health. And this includes dramatically reducing greenhouse gas emissions from power plants, vehicles, industry, and appliances and buildings. We know that burning coal, methane, or natural gas, oil, and other fossil fuels is driving climate change and making people sick from the air pollution. We need to power our vehicles, heat and cool our buildings, and run our manufacturing facilities on electricity wherever we can, and get that electricity from truly clean sources like wind turbines and solar panels. The best way to protect health is to make as much of each of these sectors zero emission as possible. Leaders also must ensure that pollution is cleaned up in all communities. So we must not allow communities that have historically borne a disproportionate burden from air, water, and soil pollution to continue to suffer the most severe health harms. We must also defend our existing clean air rules that protect our health. So this nation has strong measures currently on the books that are helping to drive down dangerous emissions. And leaders at every level should call for them to be kept in place and not rolled back or weakened. These include tighter limits on mercury and air toxics from power plants, limits on carbon pollution that drive climate change from power plants, strong limits on methane pollution from the oil and gas industry, and an updated national standard for particle pollution, new cleaner car standards and new cleaner truck standards, and investments in clean energy and clean transportation. Leaders should also ensure that funding and staff expertise for public health, healthcare, and environmental systems are in place to ensure that they have adequate resources to protect communities by identifying, preparing for, and responding to the health impacts of climate change. And finally, we must coordinate across federal, state, and local levels to empower community leaders to protect those most at risk and ensure access to continuous quality healthcare during and after disasters. Now, one way that you can share your voice and advocate for policies that will clean up air pollution and curb climate change is by joining our network of advocates at lung.org/takeaction. By joining this network, you'll receive email updates on urgent opportunities to contact your elected officials and other key decision makers about vital clean air and health issues. And that is all I have for you all today. Thank you so much for having me.
That's wonderful, Natalia. Now we have an opportunity to field some questions from our audience. And let's see, Joan, are you going to flip a switch that allows us to now see questions that may have been put in the chat, or?
I did.
Okay, I'm not seeing them yet. So let me just suggest this. If people put a question in chat during the presentation, if you wouldn't mind just putting them in again. And in the meantime, while we're waiting for you to do so, I guess I'm compelled, Natalia, to ask you, I guess, a bit more personal question. I know your role is in advocacy, and you must be feeling the stress and pressure of the radical changes that are occurring in federal policy. it strikes me that the things you have told us about really aren't partisan issues because at some of the numbers you showed relative to opinions about various topics were in excess of 60 or more percent. So I just want to know, how are you feeling given the work that you do and your sense of hope for the future?
I think that's a great question. I think everyone that I work with is, asking themselves the same things and asking their communities the same things. But I have personally found it really helpful to surround myself with people that are continuing to put up the fight and sort of advocate for what we all know are nonpartisan issues that are impacting our health. And so, the way we sort of see it is that the health community has a consensus that climate change is impacting health. It's a fact. And so we are just going to keep continuing to fight for clean air policies that will make our communities safer from the impacts of climate change that we can already see. And for me personally, I think it's been helpful to surround myself just with people who are still willing to take up that fight, regardless of sort of who is in power right now. I think, we can all continue to do as much as we can.
I have a question from someone asking about whether there is an easy or convenient way for people to identify when there are comment periods open for EPA rule changes. Can you help us with that?
Yeah, so well, one area to point you to is our lung.org/take action. So a lot of times when rules come up in for comment, we'll either provide a way for you to submit comments through our take action portal, or alert you to when these opportunities are rising. And it just sort of makes it really easy to know what's going on. And then we are also in communication, with others who are keeping tabs on all the different rules. So I think our Lung Action Network is a good place to start if you're ever interested in keeping tabs on all those comment periods. I think you can also go to the regulations.gov, but it becomes a little bit more difficult to navigate. So if you let us do the heavy lifting, we'll point you to where you need to go.
Thank you. Can you say whether the American Lung Association derives a significant portion of its funding from federal sources, either through NIH or other sources?
I can speak to my my position. I see the comment in the chat. Is not government funded, and I think on our advocacy team, I'm not sure if I can speak to the organization as a whole, but I think what I will say is that we're going to continue to find ways to fund the work that we do. And we've, had challenges before with securing government funding or whatever it may be, and we just continue to do the best that we can. So I think, there are a lot of changes going on that are impacting a ton of people, but I think we'll find ways to continue to do our work.
I'm looking for other questions, people with raised hands. If anyone has a question they'd like to pose to Natalia, please use the little icon down below to click the raise your hand button if you'd like, or wave your hand on the screen and we'll look for you. So David Clark, I see your hand raised.
Yes. Okay. My question is I hope a more progressive government for the United States take over and so can phase out the so we can get our international environmental programs easier, quicker. I hope a progressive government takes over the United States after the next election, so they can. I hope a more progressive government takes over, so you all can phase out the emissions faster to comply with international standards.
Thank you. I think what you were saying is that you're hoping people will pay attention to some of the statistics related to the impacts of
Yeah.
air pollution, perhaps internationally, to be able to
Yes.
compare with
Yeah. Yeah.
those in the United States. Did I get that right?
Oh, I was saying I hope I hope a more international focus
Yes.
president of the United States government takes so you all can speed up the international agreements.
Thank you very much. We will take note of that. Other questions or comments? There's a question about forest fire impacts. You made note of the particle PM 2.5, and I think in your presentation you connected that fairly directly with forest fires. So the question is, how does the travel of smoke from forest fires distribute those kinds of particles? How far is that distribution of those particles likely or typically occurring? Do you have any notion about that?
Yes, so I think we're still our technology to track some of these smoke impacts is still really evolving. But what we saw really clearly with the smoke from Canadian fires that traveled down the East Coast in the summer of 2023 that impacted a lot of areas that were unaccustomed to dealing with smoke impacts, is that the smoke from these larger fires that we're seeing can travel for hundreds, even thousands of miles sometimes. And they spread that particle pollution, which I mentioned, really fine particles that can make their way into your lungs and even the bloodstream and just cause a lot of harm to the respiratory system. And particle pollution has also been associated with harm to the cardiovascular system. And then, as I mentioned, with urban fires, we're seeing, new impacts around, emissions from or other pollutants that are being thrown into the air with these urban fires, including like plastics that are burning or other household chemicals that are burning, and that smoke can travel for a long ways. So I think in terms of taking steps to protect your health, we have our page lung.org/wildfire, which sort of has some steps that you can take if you are exposed to wildfire smoke. So that includes, sometimes wearing an N95 mask to protect your health, staying indoors and setting your air conditioner to recirculate so that you make sure the air from the outside isn't coming inside. Other simple steps you can take to try to reduce your exposure to that smoke. But I think in the long term, we also need investments in, smoke preparedness for communities that are, on the West Coast for a long time, we've been dealing with wildfire impacts, but I think a new range of communities are going to be dealing with these smoke impacts due to climate change. So we need those investments in smoke preparedness, smoke education, so people know how to protect their health. And obviously, also investments in policies that will help us reduce the impacts of climate change so that we're dealing with fewer of these large fires.
Yeah, we have a question about something which I think a lot of us have experienced, which is getting pushback from those who want to argue against things like windmills because of the carbon footprint that occurs in installing those kinds of devices. And there are other examples too. The large concrete bases, and as we know, concrete production is another major source of carbon in the atmosphere. So how do you respond to those kinds of challenges that want to kind of undermine the notion that reduction in fossil fuels and alternative energy sources in their place is something that we should not be advocating for?
I think that can be a tricky conversation for sure. Specifically regarding, windmills and the amount of carbon produced there. I don't personally specifically have that data on hand, but I'm happy to follow up. I think some of my colleagues might, be able to better answer that question. But I think, we try to just focus on the large scale impacts that this climate crisis will have on health. And transitioning to these clean energy modes of clean energy the science shows that it will significantly help protect people, protect their health, and save more lives. So I think the data is there to sort of respond to those kinds of pushback. But I am happy to follow up a little bit more specifically on that question.
That'd be wonderful, and we'll make sure we distribute the material you get to us. Other questions? Someone's asking, is sitting around a campfire a health risk?
So, sitting around a campfire, can expose you to a certain amount of smoke, but I think it's, nothing compared to what you'd be exposed to in the event of a large wildfire. So I think on the scale of things, we're not going to tell you not to have a campfire in your backyard, but it's important to not expose yourself to too much smoke. So if you start to feel irritated in your lungs, you're starting to cough, maybe that's a sign to sort of take a step back from the fire.
So just prudent managing of the environment that you're directly in. Can you tell us a little bit more about mercury pollution and its sources in the various kinds of things that are burning? You mentioned, the urban fires and so on as one. But is really just coal burning and forest fires the major source of mercury entering our atmosphere? Or do you know?
Yeah, and I'm not sure that the burning of the forest fires is contributing to mercury. I'm not aware of any of the data showing that the mercury is coming directly from the forest fires, but I think a lot of it is coming from the burning of the fossil fuels themselves. But I'm happy to follow up on that question also with some more specific data.
Okay. And we're all looking for alternative sources of energy. And obviously, often what comes up is, well, should we go back to nuclear? And of course, there's now a real push for geothermal energy as sources. Do you have particular resources or information that can tell us what the health impacts might be for some of those alternative sources and how they might need to be attended to as well?
That is a great question. On our lung.org webpage, if you want to search around for some more information, we have some pages that are sort of dedicated to our stances around renewable energy and the impacts there. Around fusion specifically, I'm not sure that we've taken a position, but I think our focus has been on sort of transitioning away from these non-renewable sources of energy to the ones that have proven to reduce some of the health impacts of burning fossil fuels.
And Lori's asking a long question, which I'm looking at right now. It's more of a comment, I think, about how dramatically some of the assaults on the Clean Air Act are likely to impact us negatively. And just the observation that wildfire smoke, and I think, Lori, you live in Central Oregon, is that right? That there's just an expanding time period each season for wildfires, and it's almost like, well, I think this is true in Washington State as well, where it's just expected that during certain months, July, August, September, that we're going to experience wildfires and smoke from those fires, rather than it being, a much less frequent instance or event. Other questions?
And just quickly to Lori's point, there was some alarming data released, I believe last year, that showed just how much of the progress in reducing specifically particle pollution is now being eroded by the impacts of wildfires. So, the data is there that we're now seeing sort of a trend of some of the reversal of the progress that we've made for a lot of decades. And so, the Clean Air Act, as we said, it's working, but climate change is making it a lot harder.
Okay, I think we'll now, if unless there are no other questions, we'll move to the next portion. And I want to thank you, Natalia, for grounding us in this information about the many and the disparate impacts, health-wise, of fossil fuels and the related chemicals. So we'd like now to share two impactful stories about fossil fuel and petrochemical impacts on health and the impacts of increasing extreme heat from greenhouse gases on human survival. And so I'm going to hand it over to you, Joan.
Good. I always forget to unmute myself before I share my screen, and then I get in trouble. So I'm hoping you can see my screen. Okay, this is good. I'm learning new technology tricks with this presentation. So it could go well, and it could go not so well. And let me minimize that. And I hope that when the recording gets done, it's a proper recording and not messed up by what I'm doing. So Natalia already mentioned some of the people currently being left behind and affected by air quality issues. But for the next few minutes, we want to look at some of the health hazards of the processing of petrochemicals. Back in March and April of 2022, we did a two-part series titled Issues in Eco-Justice, which is still available on the archive tab of our website. We explored the concept of sacrifice zones, areas where predominantly the poor and persons of color live near large industrial plants, and they're situated such that they tend to poison the air, the water, and the land. In the second webinar, Paul Bethel introduced us to the situation in Cancer Alley. This is an 80-mile stretch along the Mississippi River in along the Mississippi River in Louisiana, between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. Its home was originally, with colonization, it was once the home to over 500 sugarcane plantations and other plantations. The plots mostly looked like bowling alley lanes because every owner needed access to the river to ship their product. Today, those lands are home to almost 500,000 people and are the site of around 250 petrochemical processing plants, most of them located on the west side of the river, where the population is primarily, but not exclusively, Black and poor. This graphic shows the number of reported chemical spills from these plants over 1 year along just one parish in this alley. It's estimated that there are also a lot of unreported spills. Paul's report details the decades-long effort by residents to force one plant, Formosa Plastics, to stop dumping toxic chemicals into the water. Today, 3 years later, we have a current update. On March 13th, Rachel Maddow did a segment about it on MSNBC, speaking with reporter Alex Wagner. The local school board had recently decided to close an elementary school because it was so close to the chemical exposure from one of those plants, Denka, which was formerly DuPont. The full video is 13 minutes long and is available on YouTube. So here's Rachel's summary of recent events.
When Joe Biden was president, the Justice Department and the EPA decided they were going to take some action there. the Biden-era Justice Department and the EPA brought a landmark lawsuit against that big petrochemical plant, that one that's just down the road from that elementary school. It's called the Denka Performance Elastomer Plant. They make neoprene. In its lawsuit, the Biden administration alleged that the Denka facility was releasing unsafe levels of a toxic carcinogenic chemical called chloroprene into the air. They said in the lawsuit, quote, the increased cancer risk that the communities near the facility are currently being exposed to because of Denka's chloroprene emissions presents an imminent and substantial endangerment to public health and welfare. In the aggregate, the thousands of people breathing this air are incurring a significantly higher cancer risk than would be typically allowed. They are being exposed to a much greater cancer risk from Denka's air pollution than the majority of U.S. residents face. That action was taken under the last president, Joe Biden. Now, new president, radically different story. Donald Trump's Justice Department has just announced that they are dropping the lawsuit against that chemical plant. And they say they are dropping it because DEI. Huh? Seriously, they said that dropping this case, quote, fulfills President Trump's day one executive order ending radical and wasteful government DEI programs and preferencing.
Alex visited with many of the residents living in the Denka area. Now, here are just a few of their stories.
Or your circle of friends who are suffering adverse health effects because of the proximity of this plant. So everybody.
Yeah. My dad and I have experienced several generations of illnesses. My mother died of breast cancer. My sister was diagnosed with breast cancer, and my grandmother died of breast cancer.
Wow.
And my fraternal grandmother died of pulmonary disease. And so on and so on, other family members, ovarian cancer. So we are directly affected in this community. I've also had genetic testing for breast cancer, my mother, my sister, and myself, and all of them came back negative.
Wow, so it's not
a
carrying a
DNA,
gene.
correct. It's environmental.
Wow.
I have several family members that have died and passed away of cancer, some of them still living. One of my family members, she's on the list for heart transplant, two of them. One family member on the west bank of the river from Lucy in Edgard, he just had his lungs, he had a lung transplant about a year ago. My mother, she passed away. A lot of people going to dialysis centers. A lot of people have brain cancer, been high, prostate cancer is high throughout the parish, not just on the west bank of the river. Chloroprene is in the whole parish.
I grew up on East 30th Street. I've lost everyone in my family because of it, and I'm the oldest living relative on my father's side at the age of 67 due to DuPont Denka.
Wow. You've lost everyone in your
Everybody.
family.
I remember growing up on East 30th Street, and you remember the days we could sleep with our windows open? Well, a lot of mornings we woke up with this awful smell in the house. We didn't know what it was. Oh, it was just a release from DuPont. We didn't know what chemical we were breathing while we were sleeping. It was in the bed sheet. It was in your closet, in the clothes in the closet. My mom couldn't get it out the house if she aired the house out all day long. We smelled that all day long. We went to school with it on our uniforms.
Is it all cancers?
Cancers.
Everyone.
Yes.
Well, they tell stories of so many family members dying of cancer and other diseases related to chronic toxic air pollution. Their concerns are largely ignored by state and federal legislators who are so happy to have and attract large tax-paying industries. Yet the scientific evidence presented in the Biden-initiated lawsuit was that the levels of hazardous air pollutants are 10 times those in more affluent parts of the state. Here are Alex's reflections on what she heard.
We don't think about the human cost of all that. And I've covered a lot of stories in the field, Rachel. This was one of the hardest I've ever borne witness to. I mean, this is a community of people who have borne they have borne tragedy like I think almost no one else. A lot of these people, you know, one of the men I talked to, he grew up on a former plantation. These are the children of sharecroppers, and those sharecroppers were the children of slaves. A lot of these plants, Rachel, most of them, in fact, in the area, are on the grounds of former plantations. There's nowhere else in Louisiana that has that stretch of land. And it's been cleared to make way for plants that the Biden administration believed was poisoning the community. And I just, for a moment, thought deeply about not the irony, but the symmetry of what were, you know, former institutions that visited trauma upon communities of color.
DuPont and Denka have been producing neoprene, which is mostly synthetic rubber, but also solid foam, since 1930. It's in your rubber boots, garden hoses, laptop sleeves, remote controls, and so very many products that we use every day. Let's listen to this summary about one resident's ongoing life experience.
And DEI has nothing to do with the facts and the fact that this company, Dinka, was actually breaking the law. They are guilty of breaking the Clean Air Act. They put us in jeopardy. We are burying family members every week. People are suffering 20 and 30 years before they pass. That's real. That's real. We live a life every day wondering what's going to happen at our next doctor's visit.
So that's what I wanted to leave you with, and I'll now turn it over to Lori for our next story.
So I'm going to just take a moment to pause and remind us that we are talking about a just transition that leaves no one behind. When we talk about this move to work towards the reduction and elimination eventually of fossil fuels, based on the climate emergency, we are not dependent necessarily on a belief in climate change, but again, a recognition that all of these issues around a just world that we're all looking for basic health, basic issues of equity, leave no one behind. And so, as we've said before, and we'll keep saying, this is an issue that belongs in the church. So I'm going to kind of go full circle here and go back to offering a story around the effects of just the heat that is an increasing heat that is happening from climate change. So as we pivot here, our last story for today around a just transition, leaving no one behind, is going to take place in Portland in 2021. In June of 2021, a high-pressure system settled over the Pacific Northwest and Western Canada. Many of us were there, trapping a mass of extremely hot air for days on end, up to 27 days for the whole heat dome to cycle up and then finally dissipate. During this heat dome, temperature records were absolutely shattered. Temperatures reached 116 degrees in coastal Portland, Oregon, 110 degrees along the normally very cool coast in Washington, and in Canada, as you can see from the map that Rod's going to put up. Are you going to put up the map of the heat dome, please? In Canada, as you will see from the map, the heat was even more widespread, intense, and longer lasting than it was here in the US. And if you want to know more about those effects in British Columbia, you can just ask Rod.
Yeah, I'll have that in just a sec.
All right. So Lytton, British Columbia, actually reached 49.6 degrees Celsius. For those of us who are Fahrenheit temperature hearers, That's over 121 degrees in Canada. As many as 1,400 people are believed to have died, for sure 619 in British Columbia alone. And many of the people who died were by themselves and without air conditioning. So roads buckled. There you can see the map now. You can see how intense it was in British Columbia. Roads buckled. Wildfires ignited. Plants could not transpire fast enough and crops shriveled. Some people lost entire agricultural crops, and more than 1 billion marine animals are estimated to have perished in the overheated waters off the coast of just British Columbia. This was deemed a 10,000-year event. But the heat dome, as experienced, was supercharged by climate change. That means it was hotter and lasted longer than it would have otherwise. Every 10,000 years this happens because of the effects of climate change. As global warming intensifies, future events of this type will become more frequent, they will last longer, and they will be even hotter. So this question of heat, when we talk about a warming world, brings us back to this question of who's going to get left behind or not. So for more information on heat domes and the eco-justice issue around urban heat islands, I would invite you also back to our March 2022 webinar, which is archived at seaofchristclimatejustice.org. So throughout this spring series, we've been asking, what does it look like to leave no one behind as we pursue a just transition? A better question, or a companion question, might be, who is already being left behind as the world heats up? And who will be left behind if we don't pursue a just transition away from fossil fuels towards renewable energies? So here's a story I want to share. Next slide. It takes place at a cooling shelter in Portland during the Heat Dome event. I first heard this story 2 weeks ago. My local interfaith Earth Care group sponsored a watch party for the annual Earth Summit put on by the Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon. Our storyteller is Jana Papethmio. She is the Oregon State Resilience Officer, and she advises our governor, Tina Kotek, on emergency management and disaster resilience. I'm not going to tell you what the story's about. I'm just going to let it just speak for itself.
Good afternoon. As Peter said, my name is Jana Papethmio, and I am your Oregon State Resilience Officer. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be invited to speak to you today about the state of Oregon's climate resilience. To illustrate our situation, I would like to start by sharing an experience I had a few years ago. It was a Sunday, June 28th, 2021, and it was 112 degrees in Portland, Oregon. I was the interim director of the Portland Bureau of Emergency Management at that time. And so although it was Sunday, I was working. I was checking in with homeless service providers on their outreach efforts. I was calling around to warehouse stores to try and buy more pallets of water anywhere I could find it. And I was problem solving on staffing for the emergency cooling shelters. But by 8 o'clock, we were still really understaffed at the Oregon Convention Center, with more than 500 people there now seeking refuge from the heat. So when I got off my last call, I got in the car and I drove over to the convention center to work a night shift. And I called my friend Anne, and she agreed to meet me there and take a shift too. When Anne and I walked in the doors, the convention center had been transformed into something resembling a news story about a disaster in a faraway place. There were hundreds and hundreds of cots set out in rows. There was a station with food and cold water and a first aid table where dozens of people were waiting to talk to a medical volunteer. I signed in and I did a briefing with the other volunteers. And people raised their hands for tasks: registration, food station, bathroom monitor. I assigned myself a floater and started walking up and down the aisles in the shelter. I saw a mom with a newborn and a toddler. She pushed two cots together and she was nursing her baby with a blanket over her head. I saw seniors laying on thin cots with their wheelchairs parked next to them. One woman asked me when she would be allowed to go home, and I realized that she wasn't quite sure how she got there. I saw a lot of homeless folks resting and talking. There were people impaired by drugs and alcohol. There was a person talking very loudly to themselves. And there was a man moaning in pain, but he wouldn't talk to anyone else. People kept arriving all through the night shift. We gave them a cot and handed out light blankets, all very distressingly stenciled LA County Jail, because that's what the Red Cross had available for free that day. At midnight, there was an overdose in the bathroom, and we administered naloxone, and someone called 911, but I don't think anyone ever came because medical services were completely overwhelmed that day. Near morning, the person who was moaning asked for an ambulance, and thank God it came that time. They were loaded onto a stretcher and transported while the other guests looked on with concern. As people started to wake up, two men with mobility impairments got into a very noisy argument over the last loaner wheelchair because we didn't have enough wheelchairs and they both needed it to get to the bathroom. That fight definitely distressed the guests around them, and someone just started to howl out loud, and then a child started to cry. When I saw two seniors fighting over a wheelchair, I thought, okay, this is hell. And then someone found another wheelchair we could use. So both guests got one and they could go use the facilities. And then someone, perhaps an actual saint, showed up with the biggest McDonald's order ever and just started out handing Egg McMuffins. I'm not a big fast food person, but Egg McMuffins all around was pretty amazing on that morning. People started waking up and they asked what time the shelter would close because usually shelters close during the day and people have to pack up and leave. But we were able to say that the shelter was going to be open all the time until the weather cooled off. And the guests were happy to hear that. And then the day started and someone got a hold of Human Services and they agreed to put the mom with the two little ones in a hotel for the night. Later, we learned that more than 96 people died of the heat in Oregon during that stretch of hot weather. Almost everyone who passed away was alone. But in the shelter, nobody was alone. And nobody passed away. And there was unlimited cold water and ugly blankets and hot food. It was hardly heaven, but it turned out it wasn't hell either. How does this relate to Oregon's climate resilience? I think the honest answer is that shelter is a snapshot of where we are at. Our climate response is homemade. It's put together, it's not perfect. It's not all yet that we may hope. But we're saving lives, and we're expanding to meet the need, and we're definitely learning as we go. One important thing about that shelter, we didn't ask people any questions about their gender or their citizenship or any part of their identity other than what should I call you and what do you need right now? Turning people away or frightening them away with threats of enforcement, that would truly be hellish. As a state, we're holding on to our values. When we are called upon to divide people by citizenship or gender or any other way that leaves one group exposed to heat or hunger or disenfranchisement, we will not do that. We will keep showing up for Oregonians when they need us most and center our work in service to those who are most vulnerable. We can call that equity, or we can call it justice, or like the church ladies of my youth, we can just purse our lips and not say anything, but we can't stop doing the work. Communities of faith often set the example in this. As we see today, churches and synagogues and mosques, you've got a ground game. You've got grandmothers, grandfathers, favorite uncles, cat ladies with vegan potlucks, power moms who can fundraise the heck out of a food bank donation drive, and young people with energy and hope. And I need that so hard someday.
You're muted, Lori.
Thanks. Jonna goes on to describe in the part that we're clipping out here, climate resilient efforts that are specific to the state of Oregon. I just want to point out that she affirms our state's commitment, and this is true around the US, to protect the $450 million in federal climate funds that have been allocated during the previous administration, and protecting them from being pulled back. And she names pending state legislation that needs to be supported. So I don't know about you, but here's where I arrive, having seen this clip several times now, and it still doesn't fail to move me. First of all, it's important to get involved with what's happening at your state and local level, or your province and local level, or wherever in the world that you might live. There's more room to hold the line in these uncertain times by supporting and being aware of what's happening at the local and state level. So kind of keeping our focus spread wide. But the second, as I consider the question of what does a just transition that leaves no one behind look like, is that I must continue to confront my own privilege. Every time I turn on the air conditioner on a hot day, I need to be asking myself again, and then over and over again, who is it this day that's invisible to me? Well, just transition leaves no one behind. To wrap things up, Jonna brings us back to a topic that impacts everything we've talked about today. We're going to see just the last minute or so of this talk. On March 12th, just this month, Lee Zeldin, who's the new administrator of the EPA, announced plans to weaken or roll back 31 regulations put in place over decades to protect human health and the environment. So let's watch the final clip that includes a response to that announcement and an invitation to us to keep showing up.
We cannot do all the things, but everyone can do something. And as a state, we are pursuing a strategy that includes many avenues, many sectors. And in that work, we're centering people who face the greatest risks, not turning our back on them. At the beginning, Frank noted the US EPA administrator announced some big changes this week. My boss, Governor Tina Kotek, said this in response. The EPA was created to protect human health and the environment. The actions the EPA took today roll back landmark environmental regulations and will do exactly the opposite. Combating climate change requires collaboration and long-term work, not deregulating polluters, to ensure a healthy planet for future generations. There is no turning back. I guarantee that climate action will continue in Oregon, and we will continue developing innovative solutions to confront the climate crisis and build a brighter future. Thank you for the opportunity to describe some of the work we're doing, and thank you for the ways in which I know people here are supporting it. I'll see some of you volunteering in a shelter, and I'll see others of you down in Salem, because that's the work and we just have to keep showing up.
So as we wrap this up, I just want to say that we're going to have more to share about these EPA rule changes than we had time for today. But just briefly, these cuts specifically target the amendment to the Clean Air Act that gives scientific authority to the EPA to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. However, these rollbacks will be litigated vigorously, and any rule changes are going to require public comment. Hence that question to Natalia about finding a source, as she suggested at the American Lung Association's action site, that will help us stay abreast of the times when public comment is ready to be taken. So stay awake and stay ready to act. Keep showing up, whether it's at cooling shelters or at your state capitol, or at your computer writing letters to your representatives, or handwriting postcards, or even speaking up at World Conference. So we have one more opportunity to share a webinar with you before we all take off for World Conference, and I invite you to save the date of April 27th. Our working title at this moment is A Just Transition Leaves No One Behind. What? There's more? Well, yes, there is more. There's so much more. We've barely scratched the surface, and we, was noted by one of our participants today, also intend to be looking at leaving no one behind in the international picture. So as we continue to expand this vision of leaving no one behind, I have to admit, it's pretty hard to imagine that we're going to ever get it perfectly right, but we have to keep asking the questions. What does a just transition that is already underway look like? Who will be left behind if we don't risk a just transition? And how will we know who is most vulnerable if we don't even make the effort to see them in the first place? So join us. We're still refining our focus. Stay tuned. But I can promise that we will continue to navigate some understanding of the new and extra tensions in our world today, that we will find and present stories that help us broaden our vision so we can see the other, so we can better commit ourselves to a prophetic and values-driven way forward to a better world, working together. As Jonna said, you can't do everything, but everyone can do something. And together, this group and the groups that we're associated with, together, we can make a difference. So thank you for your time and attention today. We're letting you off a little early.
Lori, there was a request in the chat for you to put the YouTube link into the chat.
I'll see if I can find it, but you can Google Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon Earth Summit 2025 if I don't get it in there, but I will try to get it in there.
Stan Cook also mentioned in the chat that mercury is in the fuel that comes from the ground. That's where mercury is as a mineral, and that it does not come from burning wood. So forest fires tend not to add to the mercury problem. It is the burning fossil fuels.
And mercury is one of the things, the toxic emissions that is being reconsidered how much they're going to allow. And they're not thinking about revising it downwards.
So thank you, everyone. And you can go ahead and unmute yourself.